Good afternoon. First off, thank you very much to Elisa and colleagues for inviting me here. I feel sort of particularly privileged in some ways because, and this may be a source of disappointment, but I hope not, but I've never studied or practiced environmental law in any sense. In fact, I'm sort of slightly missold in terms of the title in the programme, I think. So I'm not actually going to talk about global environmental law, but about global environmental justice. And my background is really as an environmentalist, an environmental studies teacher, lecturer, and I've been in geography departments, I've been in an environmental science department, and currently I'm at an international development department, the School of International Development at University of East Anglia. So I'm sort of geography, development studies. I am, as advertised, a social scientist, and I probably don't go much beyond that in terms of defining my own disciplinary approach. The other thing to say by way of introduction, I suppose, is to explain away the sort of logo in the middle of the top of the screen, which is we have embedded within the UEA a research group called the Global Environmental Justice Research Group, which was established by a colleague of mine, Thomas Secor, and I'm currently the director of that group, and there's quite a lot of us who work on it. And it was interesting, yesterday there was a comment by a German speaker, I'm not sure if he's still here, but who mentioned that there's something in the sort of German history that tends towards a separation of justice issues from law issues. And I guess it's interesting that a German colleague, Thomas, was the one who sort of set this up as something which was quite distinct from the study of global environmental law. But hopefully, at any rate, when I sort of talk a bit about what we do, we can start to hopefully establish some linkages. And I guess, in a way, that's why I've been invited here. So really, I'm just going to talk about the work that we do within that group, with a bit of reference to some of my own research and some sort of some wider scanning about, what research is undertaken within global environmental justice or environmental justice research more generally. The group itself, I'll sort of use a couple of big names just to sort of say what it's about. But we sometimes quote John Rawls, who said that the first virtue of social institutions is justice. And Nancy Fraser said, well, if Rawls is right, and she thought that he was right, then the first question we should ask about any social arrangements are those arrangements just? And I guess we sort of take that to heart to some extent in relation to environmental governance arrangements, and what we ask in response to environmental problems, environmental conflicts, environmental arrangements is, are they just? And we, through the sort of research we do, we seek to encourage and support others to ask those questions about, is it just in various sort of circumstances, which of course is a highly problematized question in a sense, because there's no single idea of what just would be. So just a little bit of background on environmental justice as opposed to environmental law. I hope this isn't sort of, I suppose, telling you things that you don't already know very well indeed. But I think the first thing I wanted to, and I mentioned it briefly yesterday, but wanted to point out, is that the background is very much in a sort of activist scholar approach to generating knowledge and in terms of intentions. So you could say that environmental justice scholarship has a tradition of being inductive and learning from existing movements as to what are the primary categories of social interest and what are the concerns. And one of the examples which came up yesterday was the idea from Nancy Fraser that the three dimensions or values inherent in justice are about distribution, recognition, and procedure. And there's been similar studies by David Schlossberg just looking at the environmental justice movement in the United States, coming out with pretty much the same sort of idea of this triumvirate of concerns. But the idea is not that these come from some grand theory of justice, but they are built inductively by studying what different sort of social movements and groups actually are concerned with. So it's a movement as well as being developing into an analytical framework, and there's often an intention amongst environmental justice scholars that their work should be critical in terms of identifying the categories which are appropriate or relevant to social movements, and emancipatory in the sense that it's supporting movements towards greater freedom, democracy, however we want to define that. And then a word about the sort of, well, why global? Because the origins of that environmental justice scholarship were very much rooted in 1980s mobilizations in the United States. Well, a number of reasons why we might now think about global environmental justice research. I mean, firstly is simply a proliferation of that, and that whilst environmental justice struggles might have started in one country in the world, we now see environmental justice struggles, protests, claims in many countries around the world. So there's a sort of global spread. Slightly more sort of, I suppose, convincing than that perhaps are issues around the type of concerns and the type of environmental problems that are now being addressed. So whilst sort of localized issues of pollution and health were the initial drivers of environmental justice movements, nowadays issues such as climate, biodiversity, and so on are now at stake. Also the use increasingly of global reference, and we've heard terms such as indigeneity and rights already, which are used as part of the construction of claims by those groups mobilizing for justice in different parts of the world. So there's global terminology, albeit given issues of translation and so on. But I'm leaving a few things with question marks there, actually, because I'm not so immediately convinced that everything about environmental justice is sort of truly global. And one of those questions about whether, which other scholars are asking, is there genuinely a global environmental justice movement? And you might then ask, well, if not, then is there a global environmental justice to study as such? And the reasons there are certainly sort of global movements within particular sectors of the environment. There are food sovereignty, food justice movements, there are movements for indigenous rights, there are movements for climate justice and so on. But I suppose one of the questions is, what brings those together? Are there sort of strings through them that we can call a single movement or a single body of research even? And then a couple of the purposes, I suppose. One thing which I will talk about a bit more in a minute is that I think there's an attempt within this body of scholarship to reach or build from some kind of general theory of environmental justice and injustice, to identify the historical causes of injustice within a single world systems approach, and to use that to attribute responsibility for some of the major problems and harms that we see. So I'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. And just in passing to note, because universalism is something which has been discussed in general, but that's obviously one of the key issues whilst attempting to ask, is there something global in there? Is can we universalize statements about some of the claims that are made? Can we identify, for example, singular understandings of what constitutes an injustice that we can all subscribe to and respond to? And there are varying sort of ways of responding to that, which I'll also touch on in a moment. So, well, here's my sort of rather rough and ready and very broad attempt to sort of paint a picture of the whole world of global environmental justice inquiry. I think for those who are sort of familiar with environmental justice studies, that they may well sort of say, well, what about this? What about that? And so on. But so this is very much from my perspective and from what I see, and I'm not sort of trying to claim that it's entirely inclusive. But I've sort of tried to summarize it up into three boxes, one of which I've split down the middle. So, top right, you've got what we might call the sort of the truly normative approach based in philosophy and ethics, asking, for example, whether there are universal principles, universal ideas of the good, which can then be used as benchmarks and as action guiding to help, amongst other things perhaps, to tell us what the law should be. And that's something actually, that's an area which environmental justice scholars have treated with a certain amount of scepticism. So partly because of a sort of a tendency towards justice pluralism, albeit whilst seeking to avoid the sort of abyss of a moral relativism. So there are sort of halfway houses which have appeared in that box. I'm sort of quite attracted, for example, to ideas around capabilities developed by Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, where they develop what Sen would call a sort of minimal universalism, in which we can perhaps agree some elements of sort of universal necessity, but without treading on or sort of ignoring the fact that there are different values out there. So the box by far, which takes up by far the most of my sort of attention, I suppose, is this justice research as social science, as an object of empirical study, and as something which is highly contextual rather than universal. And I have split that up into questions about the truly global questions, I suppose, about these sort of whether there are patterns and global causal mechanisms which we can identify and associated responsibilities. Can we identify processes of unequal ecological exchange, of commodity frontiers and so on, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment again. And then thirdly, I'm not going to... Sorry, I should point to the other side of that top left-hand box, which is more the attempt, as I see it, to understand the claims made by different groups of people, both within and without ongoing environmental justice struggles. So what claims do different groups make as to what is just? What's the pedigree or the provenance of those claims in terms of the cultural context, the political context, the financial context? In other words, where do those claims come from? That there's a sort of life to them. And how do they clash with each other? Because there are often multiple claims to justice, and one of the perspectives I would take is that many of the environmental conflicts we see around the world are actually conflicts between different ideas about what constitutes justice, different claims. And then finally at the bottom, probably, you know, derivative of these two things, if the top boxes are trying to define what is just, or what do people claim to be just in various ways, then these to some extent set the benchmarks or the criteria ultimately against which we can carry out empirical work to say what are the justice outcomes. And I do, you know, a reasonable amount of this in terms of looking at, you know, what are the outcomes in terms of differentiated livelihood impacts of a forestry project or the creation of a new park or whatever it might be. I won't stray, or I won't stay for long on this particular slide. Despite the fact that this is a methodology session, but it would just take sort of too long to get into details of all of these. But obviously the point being made is simply that depending on what kind of questions you ask, and you know where you are in this sort of big picture of environmental justice research, will very much determine, you know, not just the sort of disciplines that might be relevant, but the mix of different methods that might be helpful to you. So just as an example, in terms of that sort of understanding the world system and the underlying mechanisms that produce injustices around the world, then clearly that's sort of the remit of political ecology, political economics, political science, ecological economics, to some extent development studies. And the other thing I suppose I should have noted in both of these is that there's a sort of horrible absence, which is I'm throwing out there for you in a way, because I put this diagram, or a sort of close version of it, in a book I just had published on just conservation. And I sort of realised with a certain amount of embarrassment, having been asked to come and talk here, that the word law or legal don't appear in my diagram anywhere. So I'm just sort of, I'm going to ask questions and not answer them, but I suppose the question is where does law fit into this? And in my sort of oversight, what have I missed? So just a little bit more about the, this is the top left-hand box, but the left-hand side of the top left box. But this study, or type of study, which I'm going to call global political ecology, which actually isn't particularly an area that I contribute a large amount, although there's one project which I'm part of, which I'll mention in a minute, which is contributing to this a bit. But coming from a sort of, I guess you'd call it a Marxist world systems analysis, historical materialism kind of set of influences, there's a group of political ecologists, ecological economists who are trying to understand what are the underlying mechanisms that produce injustices in different parts of the world. So to say, okay, well, you know, even in, you know, when we were sort of hearing a previous talk about the various injustices faced by indigenous people around the world, you know, if we add to those the various injustices to lots of other types of people, what are the connections? Are these just sort of isolated incidents of governments or corporations acting unjustly unjustly towards local people? Or are there sort of connections based in the direction and the organisation of the global economy, and in particular the capitalist system? So Martinez-Allier, Alf Hornborg and so on are tackling that very big, extremely ambitious programme, I would say, of trying to demonstrate actually that there are underlying mechanisms, and therefore what we need is structural change. So there's an attempt to analyse the global historical shape of these multiple instances of injustices, which we could describe as incidences of dispossession, harm, and of course on the other side, accumulation of capital by some. And there are theories related to unequal ecological exchange. There's sort of a documentation of ecological debt. There's demonstration and quite a lot of evidence for the burden shifting, such that those that enjoy the fruits of extractivism are not the ones who suffer the harms resulting from it. And these can be illustrated in, for example, the ecological footprints of nations, in studies of value chains or commodity chains. There's a number of ways of sort of gathering evidence and presenting this. But of course, very challenging to demonstrate it in a highly rigorous way. So this is one thing, clearly, that a global environmental justice scholarship attempts to do, to identify causation and responsibility at a global level, and going back through often 500 years of modernity. And of course, that's a sort of challenging thing. Where that links to how this can inform or link to the law is a big question, because the kind of solutions that this points towards are things like degrowth, changing the power structures and decision-making globally, to redistributing the fruits of extraction. One example that I have been peripherally involved with, but this is led by colleagues at the Autonomous University of Barcelona, is the Environmental Justice Atlas, which was developed really by Leah Temper and Joan Martinez-Allier there. And what this, currently it says 2,100, there's over 2,200 cases of environmental conflicts that are in the database and in this interactive map which has been developed there. It includes many of the ones that we heard about earlier, the Loliondo in Tanzania, the Niger Delta, Standing Rock, and so on. So most of the ones that are sort of well known will be in there, plus a bunch of others. And particularly for Joan Martinez-Allier, one of the original ambitions was that by mapping these environmental conflicts, these justice struggles, he could start to see the shape, the geographical shape, and to identify how the underlying world economy was producing these patterns of injustice. As I say, that is a highly ambitious thing to do, and very difficult in terms, especially when you don't have every single or even a representative sample of cases there. But an extremely interesting piece of work, and very much used by campaigning groups. And then, as a sort of spin-off from this, in a way, we're part of, led by Leah Temper at Barcelona, we're doing a sort of spin-off project called Acknowledge, which Saskia is also involved in a bit, our evaluator, actually. And that's, so I won't say much about that, but other than that is sort of turning things around a little bit. So if the previous use of the atlas has been to try and use it to identify causal mechanisms and to attribute responsibilities through that. The acknowledged problem is looking more at the nature of the mobilizations within those struggles and what we can learn from that. So, what can we learn in terms of what kind of strategies different mobilizations use? Well, a lot of them use the law in one way or another, that's for certain. What can we learn about what leads to successful outcomes, or what are the turning points, the sort of threshold, the tipping points? So that's something else. And now to the right-hand side of that top left-hand box. So this is the right-hand side of the social science approach to understanding. And firstly, to mention a sort of framework we came up with, which is a sort of loose framework which we think might be useful for trying to explore the justice claims made by different actors within these conflicts. And then to mention just sort of 3 types of example of how this might be useful. So a very simple framework developed with colleagues, including Thomas Secor, who I mentioned before, in which we say, well, perhaps these are some of the key questions we should ask about any claim for justice, or any sort of set of claims which is part of a mobilization. Firstly, what are the kind of dimensions of justice, or the values which are apparent in the claims that people make? And those might be encapsulated in these sort of existing sort of set of dimensions that I've mentioned: distribution, participation, recognition, or they may be something else. Of course, this existing sort of 3-dimensional model of justice largely arose from observing sort of Western liberal justice struggles, so isn't necessarily representative of all the dimensions of justice relevant globally. Secondly, in making these claims, who are the subjects? The subjects of justice who are considered relevant and important. Is it current individuals? Is it also ancestors? Is it future generations? Is it groups or communities? And here, at this point, we start to see challenges for conventional justice theories and for law, perhaps. What about non-human organisms? What about ecosystems? What about rivers, to use a sort of reasonably topical example? And then more from the sort of borrowing, if you like, from the top right-hand side of the diagram and the sort of normative approaches, what kind of ethical criteria or principles are people using to assert or justify the claims that they're making? Are they making claims based on equality, need, merit? And of course, these things are terribly contextual. But, if I'm making an argument about how votes should be distributed, I'm probably going to pick up on a sort of egalitarian one vote each is best. If I'm making an argument about how jobs should be distributed, I'm more likely to veer towards merit. And, when I'm talking to you here, I might even have one sort of idea that I want to communicate, but in another forum I might think something slightly different, or at least communicate something different. So these are sort of quite complex and plural ideas. And quickly, 3 examples of how this kind of approach, these lines of questioning might be useful. Well, the first, I think, is there are cases which have used frameworks like this or similar, or at least will use parts of this, that highlight the tensions between what we might call, for simplicity, global norms and local norms. Saskia mentioned earlier some of her own work in Namibia, I think, in which looking at the kind of norms that have been coming encapsulated in, for example, the CBD's Nagoya Protocol of what would be a sort of just approach to a just procedure to making decisions, which was based to some extent on representative democracy. I hope I'm remembering your case. Well, was at odds with an indigenous people's own views of what would be a sort of just decision-making, which was not to have representatives go off and talk to people and to industry officials and so on. In our own work in Bolivia, in a indigenous community in Loma Rio, the Chiquitanos community, we found that the norms embedded in a sort of global certified forestry system, in this case not norms of procedure but norms of distribution, were very much, this was a Rainforest Alliance Smartwood certification related to a sawmill and so on, were very much at odds with the local community's view of how benefits should be distributed. For one thing, it completely isolated and left out any contribution made by the elders historically to getting to a position today where they could actually have their own territory, have their own forests and manage them. And the whole thing fell apart and failed, really, as a result of this sort of clash of norms. So that's a sort of global local is one thing, but I think another, just a sort of more general sort of benefit is just understanding the pluralism that's out there and how that relates to different contexts. So we've had quite a big project on looking at local conceptions of justice in communities in Tanzania, in Bolivia, and in different communities in China, actually, in Han Chinese, Thai Chinese, and Tibetan Chinese villages, and sort of throwing the kitchen sink at this in some ways methodologically by doing ethnographic work, by doing survey work, by using participatory video, just getting people to, by using experimental economic games to try and get at, and it's a big problem, how do you get at what local conceptions of justice are. But what we find is a great amount of variety out there. So you can't, in a sense, establish a framework, whether it be a forestry framework, a biodiversity, fair benefit sharing framework or whatever, and expect it to resonate with local ideas of justice everywhere, because there's a lot of difference out there. And the third way, perhaps, in which we've applied this with other colleagues, and Lisa's been a little bit involved in this as well, it would be an example of using it to some extent as a basis for multi-stakeholder sort of ground-up thinking about how can we define equity or justice with regards to a particular sort of management issue. So in this particular case, we took the idea that the HE targets include the target that all protected areas will be managed equitably by 2020. And we say, well, but we don't even know what that means. What is it to be managed equitably? So we can then sort of take framings like this, take it out to various stakeholders and say, well, what do you think? And hopefully try to build up to at least what I came from before, let's say a minimal universalism, or at least a set of questions that we would ask in all cases. I couldn't help, I mean, that's my sort of main review. I couldn't help if, do I have a minute or two? Yeah. Just sort of respond a bit from thoughts from yesterday, really, I suppose. And so this isn't talking about the questions we ask in environmental justice research or the methods particularly, but I was just sort of intrigued by the question of how global environmental justice connects to global environmental law. and don't get excited because I haven't actually got any good answers here. But I've just, I mean, as a sort of first step, I just sort of did a rather crude sort of summary, I suppose, of what I thought Neil Walker was saying. Well, I mean, firstly, the connections are multiple, or could be multiple, and can be looked at in different ways. And on the one hand, you can take a sort of view that perhaps, law is constitutive or compositive, struggle a bit with that term, to environmental justice, or indeed the other way round, of course. I'm not a bit, or we could call it co-constitutive, might be. But on the other hand, the law might just be sort of instrumental in a sense. It might be something that people use along the way. So a quick word on both of those. And I mean, the first thing to say, and this is partly drawing on the Environmental Justice Atlas and these sort of 2,000 odd cases. I mean, the first thing is that the law is clearly extremely important to many of the movements pursuing what they call to be environmental justice. So at least in a sort of slightly earlier study, when I think there was about, at that time there was about 1,500 cases in the Atlas, and there's a sort of database underpinning it, so these, one can sort of search for these things. Over 40% of all of these mobilisations for justice had used the law in some way for lawsuits, court cases, judicial activism. That was the sort of phrase that was used in this paper. And more generally, I think we can see that, we probably all know examples of mobilisation, well, in a room of lawyers, yeah, I'm sort of saying the obvious in a way, in which mobilisations have called on the law, either seeking access to law or seeking, demanding and complaining and seeing the law in some sense as culpable, which is something else mentioned yesterday, so demanding an even-handed law, and challenging the law, often through even breaking the law. So I don't know whether it's in my county of Norfolk, people cutting down the GM crops and then going to the law and saying, go on, tell me, have I done something wrong, or similar against fracking, or there's this interesting challenging government via judges. It's interesting to hear this sort of idea that in India, there's very good environmental laws, but nothing gets done. And one of the cases in the Environmental Justice Atlas, for example, is about the river Yamuna, which is a main tributary of the Ganges, and the fact that, it's been terribly treated, as is the Ganges, over many years. And this is not just bad in terms of livelihoods and health, but is a terrible harm because the Ganges is a sacred river. And ultimately, of course, partly as a result of the various marches, protests, court cases, and so on, they did manage to challenge the government via judges who got fed up. They said it was because they were fed up with government not doing anything, and they then gave the rights of personhood to the rivers, to the Yamuna and the Ganges, such that those rivers now have to be treated as humans in law. And I don't really understand the consequences of that in the way that some others do, but it's an interesting outcome. And just to finish, in terms of so clearly the law does serve as in instrumental ways and in extremely important instrumental ways to many of these movements, and often effective as well. But then I wondered, what about this sort of deeper linkage? And I think sort of Neil put it in terms of whether, for example, there's something in the DNA of law which somehow can be a driver of justice, and to some extent dismissed that, which I think I probably would as well. And I'll just my sort of rather flaky thoughts on this wandered towards one of Barack Obama's favourite quotes from from Martin Luther King, that I think it's the arc of moral history is long, but it tends towards justice. And I do think that from a movement point of view, the object in a way, and what people seek to change is, if you like, how people think about justice and what is justice, and just to be. So the movement, in a sense, I think, is the medium between justice and law. And that is just an initial flaky thought. And I wondered whether, in addition to this sort of instrumental role, one of the key roles of law is to respond to this sort of interaction between movements and ideas about justice. And then once there is progress, of course, achieved in any way in that moral arc, to defend that progress, to sort of avoid any backslipping. But then it does just raise the question finally of whether the Anthropocene and all we've said about that in today and yesterday in any way is changing the role that the law should take or can take. Okay, sorry to leave with lots of questions rather than answers, but there we go.